Welcome to Forum 360 on Fusion, your PBS channel. I'm Ben Rancman, your host today. Thank you for joining us for a global outlook with a local view. The catalyst for today's program is a new PBS documentary on anti-Semitism. It premiered May 26th and is entitled Viral: Anti-Semitism in Four Mutations. My guest today is Todd Polkoff, the CEO of the Jewish Community Board of Akron, JCBA. Prior to joining the JCBA in December of 2018, Todd served as the president and CEO of Jewish Nevada, Nevada's statewide Jewish federation. In his over 28 years of Jewish communal and nonprofit experience, Todd has also served as Nevada State Director and Southwest Regional Director for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and has worked in the Cleveland, Boston, Delaware, and Atlantic City Jewish communities. Todd is a native of Philadelphia and holds a BA in psychology from Stockton University and an MBA from Cleveland State. Todd is an ardent Philadelphia Eagles fan and, most importantly, the father of three fantastic kids. Thank you so much. Welcome, Todd.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
I appreciate you joining us in this this Zoom format. We are still very much contending with a coronavirus situation, but we are making it happen. But I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us on this important topic. As I mentioned, there is a documentary which I have not had the opportunity to see, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. It was just released a few days ago on PBS, named Viral, and it basically evaluates anti-Semitism as a particular phenomenon. It uses the analogy, often used by anti-Semites as well as Jews as a virus, perhaps, but it sort of flips the script, so to speak, and suggests that anti-Semitism is a virus with a number of different strains, incarnations, varieties, both left-wing, right-wing, Islamic, theological, economic. It's really a sort of a multi-headed hydra, and it's a unique, in my estimation, a unique discussion just based on your background working as a professional within the Jewish community. I really wanted to sort of get your sense of anti-Semitism. Is this a problem that we are contending with increasingly today in your view? Please tell us.
You know, there's a debate going on. I think, is there more anti-Semitism, or is it just now being filmed? Is it just now being recorded more frequently? You know, the same thing was said, I think Will Smith actually said the same thing about racism, that racism has been going on all this time. It's just now being filmed. I think the rise in anti-Semitism is real, but I think the ability for us to see it and for it to be much more tangible certainly corresponds with the rise of social media, of everyone walking around basically with a video camera. But it's absolutely on the rise, and there are a number of reasons for it. We can certainly get into those, but in my opinion at least, but yes.
Well, since you've sort of brought it up, perhaps you can give us your view on why you believe that there is some sort of rise in anti-Semitism or some heightened activity in this regard.
You know, I think there are two pieces of it. One is I don't know if the anti-Semitism today is more than it was in the 30s. Okay, obviously I wasn't there in the 30s. But I will say that
30s America, because 30s elsewhere certainly.
You know, I don't know if it's the same or different than then, but what I do know today is, and I think it's been true, you know, throughout history when we've seen anti-Semitism or hate rise up, it's when it's given oxygen, and if it's given oxygen or it's given any sort of quarter or it's given any sort of pass. I think it increases. And I think that has happened over the last several years, that these things have happened in our country. It's hate. You know, it's interesting because the piece you said about the film, that anti-Semitism is a virus and it has different permutations or different variations. I would argue that anti-Semitism is one of the symptoms of the same virus as all of the other hate. So I think it's been given some room to breathe, and that room has created more incidents people feel like they have an opportunity. I also think with a depressed economy, depressed work force, high unemployment, there are a lot of angry people. And those angry people who are given an opportunity to point their anger towards something with enough of a reason to do so, and it sounds plausible, will take out their actions on those who are being blamed for it. And Jews throughout history are a very convenient scapegoat.
No, I would agree. I mean, and just in the last few days, we've seen a lot of social dislocation, the various unrest and things of that nature. And certainly as a Jew, I think whenever you have a depressed economy and approaching 30% unemployment rate, unrest in the streets, yeah, I think there's a natural tendency to fear that there's going to be some sort of upsurge, because historically that has happened routinely. I think that Jews, in my estimation, are it's a unique phenomenon, and that there's sort of a general field theory, when it comes to anti-Semitism, which is anti-Semitism can be plugged and played and can be the quote unquote solution to any problem, or the cause of any problem.
Right.
Be it economic, establishment, otherwise. I mean, it's very troubling to me. Generally speaking, I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit. You had mentioned that there's been an uptick, and certainly here in the United States, while there's a variety of different anti-Semitic tendencies, I'd like to cover them, or at least some of them, in the course of this conversation. Perhaps we can talk about the one that has sort of reared its head more recently in the United States, and that is anti-Semitism, in my mind, that is associated with right-wing extremists, white nationalist groups, things of that nature. That seems to have, there have been a number of incidents of course, in Pittsburgh with the Tree of Life Synagogue, just a short 2.5 hours from our home here. And, there's a whole series of them. And why do you believe that there's been increased activity in this regard?
Oh, boy, this is only an hour show, right?
I'm sorry, but it's only a half-hour show. Not quite 29 minutes.
Here's the thing. My thoughts on this are, one is, and again, we can have a whole conversation about Charlottesville or things like Charlottesville, that when people are given the opportunity and they go out and they do what they did and they march in the streets, and I don't care how they got there, if they were there for the statues or something else, but when they're marching in the street and they're saying Jews will not replace us, and they're clearly aligning themselves with white supremacists, and we know who those people are. They were all on camera. And again, I don't care how they got there. There is an opportunity to condemn those people quite swiftly. And I do think there's a correlation between the amount of time that it takes for the community, for public figures, to condemn those kinds of actions and the rise in the actions themselves. When it is not condemned, when it is not clearly, unequivocally condemned, these things are given some sort of oxygen. And again, if the Jewish community knows anything, it's that you better listen when someone says that they are going to do you harm. We as Jews understand that is not an idle threat, and our history shows us that. So I think when this type of speech, and I know we can get into the First Amendment, is allowed to go unchecked, it eventually turns into violence, and violence against Jews. Frankly, I think violence begets violence, and it turns into violence against African Americans, brown people, all over the country.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think there's a clear indication that any group that has a predilection for violence against one group will, in all likelihood, be more likely to, execute some sort of violent attack against another group. I think that's pretty clear. When you talk about speech in this regard, in my mind, I mean, it's a very delicate balance. So with regard to to Charlottesville, I want to preface this by saying that in my own personal opinion, I don't believe that Confederate statues or those upholding the lost cause, so to speak, have any place on any state grounds or should be given so they're imprimatur of the state. I think that those things should be moderated and put in a historical context, and they should be at a museum. maybe a museum of the Civil War and have historians sort of evaluate them, when they were built, why they were built, what they were intending to say. But certainly the Dixie flag and statues to Confederate heroes have no place on state grounds. So I do want to say that. However, when you had a number of these people sort of protesting the removal of these statues, despite my discomfort with the general premise, I do believe that we do need to allow people the opportunity to protest something in this regard. I think it falls within free speech. Now, many of the people at Charlottesville, by no means all of them, I should say, were indeed white supremacists and were people with very clear Nazi tattoos shouting things to the effect of "the Jews will not replace us." But I don't think that it is fair to say that the entire crowd sort of fell into that category. A substantial minority, perhaps, did, and they became the prevailing story. But somehow it's like, how do we balance these two things? This notion that people need the right to protest, versus and the right of free speech, versus the idea that people might have some sort of predilection towards violence.
So, look, forgive me for having a very hard line on this.
Okay.
But the minute you show up to one of those, let's say it was Charlottesville, you showed up to protest the removal of the statue.
Right.
And the minute you saw a bunch of people walking through the streets with torches yelling, "Jews will not replace us," if you do not turn around and walk away from that, you are complicit. If you do not try to stop them, if you do not tell them what's wrong with what they're doing, if you do not in some way stand up against that, in my mind, you are complicit with that. Again, you have to apologize. I don't have to apologize, but I'll tell you, I have a very zero tolerance policy for this kind of stuff. And, if we're in a group of 100 people and one person does something racist and the other 99 don't say something, you have 100 people who are acting in a racist way. Silence is deadly. So I don't care why you were there. The minute you saw that happening, tell me what Jews have to do with the removal of a Civil War statue. The minute you see that happening, if you're not walking away or counter protesting or doing something, I'm sorry, but I will count you as part of that group. I mean, it's the same argument to say that we had this conversation, Ben, about people who lived in apartment buildings in Germany or in Austria or in Poland when the Nazis came in. They lived next to Jews for 10 years. The next morning they wake up and they turn in their neighbor. They say, "Well, I didn't kill anyone." Okay. Are they culpable in some way of this?
In the wartime situation, there's a whole variety of different scenarios, some of which are as egregious as you mentioned. But would you extend that same analogy to the current unrest that's gripping us? I think that probably the majority of people who've been outraged by the murder of George Floyd had the intention of going out and protesting civilly and showing civil disobedience, which in my mind was very much warranted by that unjust killing of that man. I mean, I think all of us who reviewed that videotape saw that as a true crime.
Absolutely.
Then again, a substantial number of those people are, in my mind, just petty criminals. And these people who are ransacking downtown, smashing stores, looting stores. There have been a number of people killed in a variety of places: Detroit, Indianapolis, St. Louis. Are we willing to say that the protesters and the George Floyd protesters are all looters and thugs? I certainly don't hold that.
No, and I think there's at least from what I see, I was not able to go out and march in any of these protests. I would have loved to, but I was not able. But I think there's a fairly clear delineation between those who were there for peaceful protest and those who were there to cause harm, to loot, to do things like that. And look, I will say, I think protest at times is needed, because if you're not going to listen, there is institutional racism in this country. I will say it out loud. I think more people with my skin tone should say it, should admit it. When African Americans or those aligned with non-racist entities or non-racist ideologies try to peacefully protest, what was the backlash when the NFL players knelt? I mean, it was as though they were burning flags in the middle of the field. right? There have been peaceful protests time after time. At some point, the pot boils over. But I think to your original question, I think there's a fairly clear delineation between those who are peacefully protesting against institutional racism, and those who are out in the street specifically to do harm to businesses or other people. So I don't put them in the same place.
No, and that was precisely my point. But I think that they were oftentimes coming out for the same event. I certainly think that civil disobedience protest with regards to police brutality and the number of these incidents that we've seen repeatedly is entirely legitimate. Mm-hmm. And I think that most sort of right-thinking people would probably concur. But it can't be denied that a lot of what's happening right now is just petty criminality.
Look, Rahm Emanuel said, and it works both ways. You never let a good crisis go to waste, right? And there are people out there who believe that this is their opportunity. They're driving in from out of state. And I'm not saying I know that for sure, but I know from people who live in certain communities where this has happened. Right. People are taking this opportunity to say, okay, this is the window I have. It's unfortunate that they are representing everyone else because that's what the media picks up. But there are some phenomenal examples of people peacefully protesting, police departments peacefully protesting. Camden, New Jersey, the police chief was carrying the banner at the front of the march. We've seen in Flint, Michigan. I do not put those people in the same category as those who are out just to be opportunists of this occasion.
No, certainly not. Certainly not. I was just bringing it up in a sense to highlight that there may have been some sort of dichotomy in the Charlottesville marches, despite the fact that, I agree with protesting the George Floyd murder. I do not agree with the preservation of these Confederate statues. That being said, I'm still willing to recognize that not all these people had evil intent, and somehow to legislate against these protesters in some sort of way, to me, frightens me as a person who advocates for First Amendment rights.
Sure.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah. And, I did want to sort of move on to some other variants of anti-Semitism. My own personal background, I'm a child of two Polish Jews, actually. My parents immigrated to the United States in 1969 and 1971. And if that sounds like a later date than most Polish Jews, you would be correct. So my parents actually lived in Poland. My grandparents decided to stay in Poland and make their life in communist Poland at that time. There was a little known event in Western history called it was the 1968 political crisis in Poland. And much of it came in the aftermath of the Six-Day War in Israel. And the Jewish community in Poland, which at that time numbered about 50,000 individuals, my parents and grandparents being amongst them, which is not an insignificant number. I mean, before the war, there were 3 million Jews in Poland. After the war, 50,000. It's a shadow of its former strength. Nonetheless, this community did exist, but they were essentially purged from Poland. Many of them lost their positions in government, academia, military, etc. And much of that anti-Semitism, to my mind, the way it developed to me, it seemed like the seed bed of the classic some of the classic left-wing anti-Semitism that we see today. For example, schools and Jewish youth groups were prohibited from teaching Hebrew. Yiddish by the communists was, of course, allowed because that was considered an indigenous language to Poland, but Hebrew was considered an imperious language or a reactionary language. People lost their jobs. Jews were termed rootless cosmopolitans. There were protests in the street. People lost their jobs because of their Jewish backgrounds. The irony, of course, is that many of the Jews who decided to stay in Poland in the post-war period were assimilationist-minded individuals. They may have had the opportunity to emigrate. These were people who wanted to sort of throw in their lot with the socialist government, and they thought perhaps this was the way of the future. And nonetheless, it didn't happen. And I thank the Jewish Federation of Cleveland and the Joint Distribution Committee for helping to resettle my parents in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. But they left under those circumstances. And to me, that was sort of the seedbed of left-wing anti-Semitism, which developed later and still exists. What are your thoughts on sort of sort of the increase in anti-Semitism sort of emanated from sort of left-wing sources as well?
So, some of this goes back to look, I believe what the UN believes in that, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Okay. And if using that as a basis, first of all, the international community has shown time over time, and some of these countries that are much more to the left, I'm not saying that left and socialist are synonymous, but certainly much more on the socialist side of a governing structure, are some of those who are the worst offenders when it comes to condemning Israel for things and coming down on the Jewish community in general. I think, look, on the left side of politics in our country, I think when elected officials stand up and they say things that are anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, hurtful to the Jewish community, there should be also swift condemnation of them from the left. We've certainly seen here in Ohio, we've had with Dr. Acton, and I think she's done a phenomenal job. It has nothing to do with her being Jewish, but it's been brought into the conversation. I think whenever it comes from the left, it comes from the right. It's on both sides. And I think the extremes, the far extremes of both of these, when they come full circle, they're almost the same people. They're almost taking the same line of thought. There certainly is violence coming from the left. There's certainly violence coming from the right. The fact that we have to talk about coming from the left, coming from the right, it's coming from people who have a warped ideology and are blaming others for the problems that are happening. There are problems, but you can't pick out a certain country. You can't pick out a certain people and say it's because of them. And of course, almost all of it is baseless. But you need a scapegoat. And that's why I say anti-Semitism is not the virus itself. Anti-Semitism is one of the offshoots of the virus, which is hate and ignorance.
Yeah, and while I will agree that there is a certain component of anti-Semitism that is sort of just general xenophobia, and we've seen that in a variety of contexts. You can see that against ethnic Chinese in Malaysia. You can see that against people from the subcontinent in India and in parts of Africa. You can see that in
the Kurds in Iraq.
That to me is a very simple and easy to understand sort of xenophobia. In some cases, it's really just I don't like that this is a different group. We're in some sort of a national struggle where I want my language, my religion, my ethnic group to predominate, and your existence threatens that. So as ugly as that is, it's something that I can wrap my mind around. It's relatively simple to understand. To some extent, sort of the various other incarnations are what trouble me, and that the fact, when you see sort of anti-Black sentiment, as evil and awful as it is, and we know that it has very real-world implications, it's an ideology that I think is pretty simple to define. It sort of has, Blacks are inferior intellectually, or they're prone to violence, or they're, any of these awful things that are sort of brought about by Blacks and are said about Blacks. And it's awful and has real world implications and needs to be fought. I'm not minimizing what that ideology is. What I think is unique is that anti-Semitism can slide in and out. I think it has its roots to some extent in theological notions that Jews were sort of the killers of Christ, and sort of, and by that basic nature, not only are they cosmically evil in that they've killed God himself, but they're incredibly powerful because they're powerful enough to kill God himself. And that has allowed it to transmogrify into various forms where, Jews are sort of the hand behind the scenes in economic affairs, and they're the ones really dictating what's happening in the world, the sort of the Illuminati myth and all the rest of it. If they've ever seen me trying to pay my bills at the end of the month, I think they would.
Yeah, but Ben, you have to. There's at Yad Vashem in Israel.
Yes.
There are two sculptures in the main courtyard of Yad Vashem.
Right.
One is set into the wall, and it's Jews carrying everything they have. I can't remember the name of the artist for the life of me. Carrying everything they have over their shoulders, traipsing Trail of Tears. The other one is set out from the wall, and it's the depiction of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
Right.
It's the point where Jews actually start defending themselves. Before the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Jews were a very easy target. Right? Jews did not defend themselves the way they do today. There was no state of Israel. And, there is also the path of least resistance. If you're someone who is looking for a scapegoat, anti-Semitism is the grandfather of hating groups, of hate and ignorance towards specific people.
Yes.
And, it has been something that is.
It's a real conundrum. And Todd, I'm sorry to cut you off right
there.
No,
it's okay.
We are wrapping things up. This conversation moved quickly. I just want to thank you for joining us here at Forum 360.
My pleasure.
I appreciate Todd Polkoff for coming here and having this conversation with us. As we can see, we have this is a nearly inexhaustible topic. Perhaps there's material here for a future show, but nonetheless, I'm glad we got to engage in it in some form or fashion. Thank you for your insights in the matter, and I appreciate you for joining us on Forum 360, a global outlook with a local view. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.